But the novel actually is a microcosm that encapsulates all the very difficult, tangled processes going on in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands today. We're also going to be discussing his book of journalistic writings called Islands in Flux. Even though I've actually visited the islands only once and very briefly, I've always had a sort of fascination with them, because if you look at a map of India, it seems almost like an accident of history that India happens to have, that the islands seem to be included in India. Because if you look at the structure of that particular stretch of the Bay of Bengal geographically, geologically, properly that is a string of islands, an archipelago that is an extension of the Arakan Yoma Mountains in Burma. So part of the history that made the Andaman and Nicobar Islands a part of India and what that relationship has meant is something that Pankaj will be talking about today. And a little bit about Pankaj. He's a man of many parts. He is well known as an environmental journalist. He's also been a long-time activist among other organizations. He's been active with Kalpavriksh, the environmental action group that works on issues of environmental justice across India, community rights to resources. And he's also someone who has a PhD in science and technology studies. And appropriately enough, given all of these different expertise, Pankaj also has had a meandering career. He began life as a mechanical engineer. He went on to do a degree in mass communications, and then finally a PhD in science and technology studies. And when one tries to find a common thread through this meandering trajectory, I think it's the quest in your work, Pankaj, of trying to identify what exactly constitutes progress and what we call civilization. And this involves, I think through your work, a constant questioning of the idea of the good life as described in terms of material affluence, in terms of always wanting more and more in terms of consumer goods. I think it's also the ways in which you question what forms of knowledge we value. Is it a certain kind of conventional science technology that is thought of as a way of dominating nature? Or whether it's something that is based on a more organic connection that, as you said yesterday, recognizes with humility the extent of one's dependence on nature and the extent of one's ignorance in being able to deal with nature. So I think that these particular issues of knowledge and power and progress and science really come alive in your work on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And its particular distinctive feature, which is the association between immense biological diversity as well as great cultural diversity. And if there is something that we need to be acutely aware of today, especially in our country at this time, it's about the need to preserve that diversity, both biological as well as cultural, because we're seeing forces flatten both our cultural variety, the source of our great beauty and strength, as well as our biological complexity and richness and wealth. And those are the topics that Pankaj will be talking about today in that most interesting of places, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands.
Pankaj. Thanks, Amita. What we'll do is, I'll do about a 10 or 15 minute PowerPoint presentation to kind of take you to that place to the extent that one can take in a presentation. So this is about 20, 25 years of photography that I have been doing in the islands, and it kind of builds up and helps me build up the story that I want to tell. So about 15 minutes, we'll keep an eye on the clock so that then we can have a discussion and then also open it up. So I would love to, and I can stand for that reason, is to, can we have the PowerPoint? There is a, it's not displaying right. The image is cut at the top. Is that how it's going to be? Yeah, okay. So maybe, no, okay. All right, okay, fine. So what I've come to realize about the islands and about the stories I tell about the islands is of the journey. And it's about two kinds of journeys, and we'll perhaps also discuss that. One is the journey that the islands themselves make, historically, geologically, within a certain time frame that I have worked on and I have understood the place. And always going parallel with the journey of the place is the person who's telling the journey. So it's the journey of the person who's narrating the story of that particular place. And I have been working there for the last 25 years. So of course, a lot of what I have done and how I have grown and I have been influenced is about, in some senses, in the relationship with that particular place. So here I will stress on what the journey of the islands is as I see it, because all journeys are unique journeys, and no account of the place will be the account that I kind of put across, because everybody chooses what we see and what we talk about. So next one. And as the title of the session is Islands in Flux, the Last Wave, so the books that I've done in the last 4 or 5 years, these are 2 books and Amita mentioned them, are an account of the journey that those islands have made. One in a form of fiction, which has an interesting history as to why it came about, and more recently is the Islands in Flux, which is a compilation of about 25 years of journalism in these islands. Next. Yeah, so quickly to the point that Amita made, these islands, you see, are extremely far, far away from mainland India. They are about 1,200 kilometers from the main ports of India of Chennai, Calcutta, and Visakhapatnam. And as the arrow shows, yes, it's part of India, but exactly like Amita said, it's very much an accident of history. It is, and if you can make out at the right-hand bottom, you have the little island of Sumatra jutting out of the map, and there's a little star that I've marked out there. And it's not very accurate, but it's approximately, and I want to mark that because that's really central to the story of the islands in my understanding today. This is the epicenter of the earthquake of December 2004 that caused the gigantic tsunami that we know 2004 for. And you can see the proximity of that center to the islands, which is absolutely not really known about. I'm going to quickly run you through some of the beauty that Amita mentioned, and one won't have the time to really go into the details, but the spectacular biological diversity, the richness of the plant, animal life, of the ocean life that we have in the islands is just about being documented, and is spectacular to say the least. Next. Rich tropical forests. You see a very interesting cross-section here of the mangroves at low tide, going into the littoral forests at the back, and then as you go up the gradient, because these are the peaks of a submerged mountain range, so it's almost like, you know, a roller coaster kind of a landscape. And going up the gradients, you see in this picture particularly the very lush, rich tropical forest, and you see these white trees that shoot out on the top of the canopy, as it were. And this is a particular species that's important because it was the main timber source in the islands, the main source of industry, which was the plywood industry. It's a particular species of tree. Next. Rich, I mean, absolutely astoundingly rich where the biological diversity is concerned. I'll give you just a few examples. This is a little flower known as the Papilanthe teres, which is a very common flower. It's also there on the cover of my novel because it has a very interesting ecology. It does not even grow in a forest where the canopy has not been disturbed. It requires for the direct sunlight to reach where it grows to even take birth. So the presence or the absence of the flower becomes, in the novel and otherwise, an interesting ecological indicator of what intervention has taken place. So the presence of the flower means, for instance, that the forest, the original forest canopy has been disturbed at some point of time. Next. Island systems, we all know, are very rich in endemism. And I'm assuming most of you would know, but just quickly, that it is a geographical restriction, a very important evolutionary process. Island systems, because they are separated from other land masses by the sea for thousands of years, develop unique forms of creatures that are found nowhere else on the planet. So this is the Andaman day gecko. You know, the name also holds the name of the place. A brilliant emerald, translucent green kind of a little gecko that you find commonly in the Andamans, not in the Nicobars. Next. The Andaman pit viper. Next. In the Andamans, the Andaman kokal or the Andaman crow pheasant, also known as the brown crow pheasant. For the bird watchers, you'll be able to recognize the common crow pheasant with hoo, hoo, hoo kind of loud metallic call. You find around here, it's a relative of this one, but a distinctly unique kind of species, a smaller one, a different color, a subspecies of that particular bird. Next. And perhaps the most charismatic of the birds that the Andaman and Nicobar, exclusively the Nicobar is known for, is this bird known as the Nicobari spur fowl or the Nicobari megapode, which has a very, very interesting behavior. The nest of the bird is actually a mound of earth that the two parents scrape up, and the eggs are laid in that mound of earth. They don't incubate the eggs. And the bird is also known as a thermometer bird, because though they don't incubate, they still need to ensure that the temperature around the eggs is right. So they keep checking with the beak and get the temperature right to be able to then have the right kind of incubating conditions. Next. Very rich mangroves. Here you see a very interesting adaptation of breathing roots, where roots which normally grow towards gravity go against gravity here to actually help the plant breathe, because soils being waterlogged don't have air and the plant requires to breathe. And many, many things within this which I won't go into detail. Next. And within that mangrove root system is this fiddler crab, supporting a huge amount of diversity. These ecosystems, along with, say, in the coastal and in the marine with the coral reef, support a massive amount of diversity on which, importantly, huge human communities are dependent for the fisheries and what we get out of that particular place. Next. A mud skipper. Next. And then going into the oceans, this is the sea anemone. The Finding Nemo generation will easily recognize that. Has a very close association with the clownfish, a very strongly associated species with the coral reefs, rich ecosystems, biodiverse ecosystems, very important for livelihoods and stuff like that on the islands. Next. Within that coral reef system, an eel. So it's a complex system that supports life of different kinds and each supporting each other. Next. Jellyfish, which the Nicobari tribals have started to now call the panni machi, the panni being the thin plastic. And I mean, it's critical to kind of realize the kind of impact we are having on the oceans of the planet, because recent study says that by 2050, if we don't reduce our plastic consumption and the plastic waste, we'll have more plastic in the oceans than we'll have fish. And this is also important because in the food chain, they're very important parts of what other creatures consume. And there are thousands of cases where creatures are dying because consuming plastic, thinking it to be food, for instance. Next. And I think one of my most favorite kind of creatures in my experience is a creature that's left this mark behind on a beach in the Nicobar Islands. It's a turtle, it's a sea turtle that in the local language is known as the tractor kachua. So it's a huge creature. It's the track of the giant leatherback, which is really a giant and one of the gentlest giant on the planet. It can grow up to 6 feet in length, can be 400-500 kilograms in weight. And what's critical is that these little strips of land on our coastlines, the beaches for which we are looking at for our tourism development, for all kinds of things, are those spaces where these creatures need to absolutely crucial for their survival. Because a turtle, once born on land, goes back into the sea, and if it's a male turtle, never comes back to land ever. Only the female comes back once in a year or once in 2 years to lay her eggs. And that tiny strip of land is crucial for the survival of the species that has been on the planet for millions of years. And if you look at what's happening on the coastline, we all know the kind of challenges that are being put forth. Next. This is the giant leatherback turtle. On the island extreme south in the Nicobars, very close to Sumatra, female turtle has laid her eggs and is going back into the ocean. Next one. And this is a picture I took on my first trip 25 years ago. This is the baby turtle. So you have a 6-foot mother and this tiny little baby that fits in the palm of a human hand. It's really at the crux of it is the vulnerability, of course the beauty, but the vulnerability of what it means when we change and what we are doing to the planet. Next. I'm going to, so there is this little aspect of the beauty of the place, and that other part of the story when I started to work in the islands in the 90s, just quickly to relate, one key kind of catalyst in my understanding, and at that point of time my disappointment and even anger, was this 1965 report. Like many reports we have in the country about development and about what should be done to a particular place. And the whole idea of looking at a place is empty of everything and open for use for a certain kind of idea of development and progress and things like that. And in the islands, that's the other story which, again, we don't have the time to go to in great detail, are the human communities that Amita mentioned. A community known as the Jarawa, which has been there for about 40,000-50,000 years, a small community of 400 people today, have lived isolated lives in the forests for thousands of years, rapidly changing, I mean, at the moment, even as we speak, culturally and in other ways. But in 1965, when the government of India, a very high-part committee, wrote this report for the development of these islands, the next one, you know, these islands that have been inhabited by these people for 40,000 years, where at that point in the 50s, already they have constitutional guarantees, is referred to as a space that is infested by this community. And it lays the ground, and colonization, for example, is a word constantly used. It lays the ground for a certain idea of development, for a certain idea of what will come. And these are some examples of what I want to kind of put across to say that is the context. This is a history and a journey of the islands that we don't get to know today, because the islands are known for tourism, for the tsunami, for cellular jail, for Savarkar. But there's a much more complex, much more layered history and journey that that place has taken. And that is the context that I want to kind of put across. Next one. And you know, that kind of development paradigm is I'll just give you some pictures of more recently from the 90s. This is a full-grown elephant in one of those forests, and you can see the size of that timber, size of the forest that we have over there, towering tropical forests that have been cut down for this idea of development, for instance. Next. Forests burnt, because that's the best way to clear these forests for putting them to more productive use. Next. You know, the coastlines are mined away, and you know, all kinds of problems with that. You have to build seawalls because nature's protection has been taken away. Next. And you know, again, quickly to 1965, we had a Jarawa infested forest. This is a 2016 report commissioned by the Niti Aayog for the development of what they're calling the holistic development for the islands. And the reference are, for instance, are the Palm Islands of Dubai. And it is astounding and shocking and scary that the realities of the place and the flux that I talk about in my new book, the changes that actually the islands experience and are constituted by are completely missing in the narratives of what the islands are. So, next one. And what's very important is the fact that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, if you look at the little red that's jutting out on the left of the screen, they are a part of the Ring of Fire, which is not really acknowledged for what the importance of that thing is. It's a place that's constantly tectonically active. And that is why the earthquake that caused the tsunami of 2004 happened in that space. There was an earthquake in the Andaman waters 10 days ago. It happens twice a month. And this is the kind of reality that is completely missing in the development policy planning, and that's the big concern that one has going forward. Next one. So what happened, and I'm just going to take 2 minutes here, is what happened in 2004 on December 26. When we talk about the islands, we always talk about the tsunami, but what really happened is, if you look at my hand here, with the Andamans in the north and Nicobars in the south, with Port Blair, the administrative headquarters in the middle, the islands swung as if like a child's seesaw in the playground. So the Andamans in the north came up in parts by about 4 feet in one morning, and the Nicobars in the south submerged permanently that morning by about 15 feet. And these are just satellite images 4 days before the earthquake and the evening of the earthquake. And you see the yellow circle on the right-hand side. That shows what area was land is now submerged, and maximum number of people died here. Okay? There's a very, very stark kind of change that takes place in the place. Next. So this is what happened in the north. A coral reef that is permanently supposed to be underwater is now permanently above waterline. So you have these boulder corals that are about 4 feet in height, and they have been thrust above the waterline permanently, destroying the coral reef system, but creating a new system, which is what constitutes the creation and the existence of a system like the Andaman and the Nicobar. Next. And this really is a scary map, because again you can see the yellow big star on the kind of middle of the image. You see yellow dots, you see Sumatra and you see Myanmar. You don't see the Andaman and Nicobar Islands because they're covered by yellow dots. The yellow dots are the epicenters of earthquakes and aftershocks between 2004 and 2008. This is the kind of tectonic activity that happens in this particular place. And I'll just give you examples of what I mean when we're not accounting for that. Next. So, and then we have more recent, what's happened in the islands is this narrative of security, for instance. And 2014, a prominent commentator writing about the islands as a prized piece of mid-ocean real estate. And the language is very interesting. So what the islands' journey has been in a sense from Jarawa infested to being a piece of mid-ocean real estate that's valued. And that really, for me, is very worrisome, and I don't like it, because that's not the way I would like to look at the island. They're not a piece of real estate. There's a lot more to that place. They're not empty. It's not empty by any measure, for that matter. Next. And even more scary, in 2009, in a defense seminar in Port Blair, the former president, the late President Kalam, in his vision for the islands, 5 years after the tsunami has hit, actually talks about a 250 megawatt nuclear power station in that most tectonic zone on the planet. And that is really, really scary. It is something that may not ever happen. But what is the vision that we're talking about for the country, for the planet? And that's something I really want to kind of end this with. And with the last slide, next one. So the flux that I'm talking about, at the bottom is a picture of the tribal community, the Jaravas, a picture by my anthropologist friend Vishwajit Pandya. In the middle is the ecology, and on the top is the geology. And three very important constituents of the systems that we are part of, either as a tripod that brings stability or as one layered on the other. Like Pranay Lal says, let's look at what's under our feet. What is the soil and the geology? On that is based the ecology, on which is based the socio-cultural system. And all these three are not being accounted for. That's my primary kind of contention. And then when we have something like a Kalam talk about a nuclear power station, we know, I think we've completely lost the plot, because it's actually inviting a lot more trouble. We're increasing the vulnerability that we think we will actually do away with. So I'm going to end with that, and thank you very much, and over to you, Amita.
Thank you, Pankaj. That was a very, very masterful summary of a whole range of complex issues. Let me begin by first asking you about something that you ended with. The fact that the islands, to the minds of the Indian government, represent both a strategic space in terms of an outpost of India that has a certain value geopolitically, as real estate. But what makes it possible to imagine the islands as real estate is to see them, as you were saying, as empty. And there's this concept of terra nullius, of empty land, that has been at the center of what's called settler colonialism. The idea that white people exploring North and South America, exploring Australia, could look at a landscape and think that it was empty and therefore ready for them to settle down. And that therefore was a process that resulted in the genocide of Aboriginal people, both in Australia as well as the First Nations people in North America, in South America, and so on. Would you say that there are similarities between that historical process of settler colonialism in terms of the extermination of native populations and the extraction of resources that happened in Australia and in the Americas, and what is happening, say, in India with the Andaman and Nicobar Islands today? Or would you say that that's an exaggeration?
I wouldn't say it's an exaggeration, but I think there are very many interesting parallels, and I would even go ahead to say it's not just about Andamans. I mean, I think on mainland India, where the resources are, where you worked for so many years, there is that sense of an available resource and an empty space, either to put in a defense establishment or extract resources, and there is no empty space actually. I mean, it's amazing. So when I wrote that article where I quoted the Kalam is that because it started off with the testing of the BrahMos missile in a Nicobar island in 2008, and I was on a journey with my family from Pune, actually coming to Jaipur for a holiday, and there was a series of journalists asking, this testing has happened, what is the environmental impact? And I said, I don't even know what the BrahMos is, and I don't know what the environmental impact will be, but because I don't know what's happening. But the very idea that struck me and the question that struck me is, why do we use a particular landscape to test something like that? Because we believe it is empty. What else would we use that for, in the sense of, why would we use it for something if we thought it was useful otherwise? Yeah. So in that sense, I think, and the history of the islands, certainly with the British, so the extermination, whether it happened very deliberately, perhaps no, but I think by setting in these processes, that's what we end up doing, because that's what happened in the British, and it, in a sense, continues now. Yeah.
You know, your last slide, the middle part, which depicted the ecology, It's that ecological richness which, as you said, is responsible for part of the attraction of the island for the government, that you can generate revenues by cutting down all those magnificent dipterocarp trees and so forth. But there's another element that needs to be put in, and there I think there's actually a parallel between what China has been doing in Tibet and what India has been doing with the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is to settle populations from outside. Again, the empty landscape principle at work, so that what were once islands just inhabited by small communities of the Jarawa or the Sentinelese or the Nicobaris and all the other tribes are now places where the tribes are probably outnumbered by other people who have been settled there by the government as a part of policy. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that complicates resource dynamics in the area?
So historically, the islands have been inhabited by these indigenous communities, very small numbers. And again, starting with the British because of and wanting a penal colony and stuff like that, the numbers have changed dramatically. So if you look at the population figures, of course, the islands still don't have too many people compared to what, say, we have on the mainland. You only have, by the official figures, about 400,000 people, that's 4 lakh people, which is actually a very small number by any standards. But the ratios are kind of dramatic. So from, like in this little island of Little Andaman that I write about somewhere, I mean, a big island of what's called Little Andaman. About 50 years ago, the indigenous community there, a community called the Onge, which today is only 120 people, the ratio was like maybe 1:1. One Onge with one outsider. Today it is 1:120. So the numbers might still be about 20,000 people only, but the ratios, like you say, have changed. And then, of course, the claims to resources, and more than the claims to resources, I think it's the sense of identity, the sense of what are we and what should the place be. So it's been described as a place like mini India. So you want, so what is the space for that local culture and that local kind of specificity, which is completely lost out? And I mean, if I just kind of widen that question is, I just feel that, and what we discussed yesterday, you know, the small and the slow gets completely missed out in the larger narratives of nation countries and history. And I think that is what we need to kind of also deal with. And this question that you ask, if one was to turn it around and look at that space from the viewpoint of the tribal, or even for the turtle for that matter, then it's not an empty space at all. Yeah. And can that be the way forward is something that, in terms of how we look at that place. Right.
So in that context, tell us a bit more about the struggle for the road and what that road represents for the Jarawa, for resource politics in the area, and about your own activism in connection with trying to make a difference with that specific issue.
Yeah, so the history of the road is a very interesting one. There is the Andaman Trunk Road that runs, you know, because it's a pretty linear kind of island system from Port Blair right up to the north, almost into the islands that, almost into Burma in a sense. And this is a road that was, in the 60s or 70s, was started to be constructed. The main idea was to remove timber. I mean, it comes up for that. But it was also deliberately a companion for the process of the colonization, because people in the 50s and 60s and 70s were being brought in from mainland India. They were to be settled there because, on the one hand, people who were brought in were a lot of them were, say, East Pakistani refugees, and people who had a very bad deal anyway. So, you know, it's in some senses putting the most vulnerable in conflict with the second most vulnerable. And these were large forests that were inhabited by these tribal communities, which were extremely hostile historically. So the Jarawa, till about 15 years back, had a history and are still well known for being extremely hostile. People were being shot by bows and arrows all the time when they tried to enter the forest. But these were the forests that were seen as available and empty, and the road became a vector, a physical vector and a metaphorical vector of bringing in the outside, taking away the resources, primarily timber. And I say metaphorical and literal because it also brought in the impacts of the cultures of outside. And in some senses, it's inevitable, like Vishwajit keeps saying that there is never an isolated community in the world. There never has been. There's always been some kind of interaction. But here, it really hastens that process. So we, as part of the work that I did for Kalpavriksha, we took some matters to court, coming to cut that long story short, in 1998. And then, you know, matters in the court take a life and a journey of their own. It's not in your control often. So we had actually a very good set of orders in 2002 based on a commission that the Supreme Court set up. One of the orders of the court was to actually shut down part of this Andaman trunk road as it ran through the forest of the Jaravas. And incidentally, it is along these roads that you see the flower I spoke to you about in the very beginning. You don't find that in the dense forest where the Jarava live, because that canopy has never been disturbed. So the court ordered for the road to be shut. We're talking of 2002. And of course, it is a problematic kind of order, because there are at least 100,000 people using that road. And they were extremely upset about that fact. They didn't want the road closed. But there was a court order, and I also write somewhere in the novel, in the balance between the convenience of 100,000 and the survival of a few hundred, where would, the tarazu kis taraf jhukega? And I have my position very clear. But of course, for the others, it was not acceptable. And even today, 2018, more than a decade and a half later, that road still remains open. So the entire context has changed. I don't even know anymore if that order is relevant. But it's counterintuitive to think that a road is not development. And we, again, as we discussed yesterday, there are huge histories around the planet where the road infrastructure has been the primary agent of huge destruction, wiping out, extermination. So that, in a sense, is, and actually the non-closure of the road and the disappointment of that was a very significant catalyst in trying a different form of engagement, which then became the novel. So in some senses, the novel is about this story that I've narrated to you, but in a form and a genre and a kind of writing that hopefully reaches out to a different audience in a new way, or the same audience in a different kind of way.
Yeah. It's actually around that road that we see these very striking, at the same time very disturbing images, which are of Jarava people coming up to either a car or a bus, and there's people handing over bananas or biscuits to them. The way you might do it to, I mean, I hate to say this, but the way you might do it to, say, a swarm of langur or monkeys that come up to your vehicle in a national park. And there is an argument that those who speak for development have made. How far, I'm paraphrasing this is not an argument that I subscribe to at all, but they say, how long can people live in this primitive stage? Surely it's in their interest that we need to assimilate them into our culture, which would mean more clothing, eating a different kind of food, speaking Hindi, going to school, having access to health care. So the hostility that the Jarava have always shown earlier in terms of shooting arrows at people who would come in and try to land on their shores has now gradually been punctured. So there are more and more Jarava who are dependent on handouts from the government. So there is this strange process by which that policy of assimilation is in fact proceeding. And it's very hard now to make the case of trying to leave them alone, which was what the road, the closure of the road was meant to help. So how would you describe this situation now? What are the terms of engagement today, given that the Jarava are already, in a way, a part of that economy of government handouts? How do you think they can, in some ways maintain their own sense of self, have some control over how they would like to lead their lives, and the onslaught from the government, which on the one hand is really, really hostile because it's taking away their resources, but at the same time is accompanied by a so-called benevolent paternalism, that, we will look after these people. And for me, one particular incident is very telling, that there was a Jarava boy who broke his leg. And given that there are only about 400 of them in the world, this was a major source of anxiety for the tribal welfare department, for whom every Jarava life is precious. So this particular boy was taken with his broken leg to on a plane all the way to the mainland, to Chennai, to have his leg fixed. And as someone who works with Adivasi or tribal populations in central India, I was just staggered by this, because the number of Adivasi children who die every day and go uncounted is huge. And yet one Jarawa boy is treated as precious. So that's the kind of strange paternalism that we find in the Indian government, even as you're actually, they're undermining, cutting the ground away from the feet of the Adivasis who so far depended on the land. So, can you describe this strange, this paradox of preservation and destruction that seems to be happening around indigenous communities in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands?
I think it's a very complex kind of thing to kind of have a sense of even. But I think the idea that they're talking about, I think is the paradox, and that is the conundrum, because the Jaravas are changing so rapidly that stories that I've heard are amazing. I'll just give a little instance, and I'm not 100% sure if it is true, but even if it's partly true, this friend of mine who works in the islands said that there was a social worker who was working with the Jaravas, and he wanted to actually film a little clip of the Jaravas talking something, because now they're talking Hindi, and it's a completely different world from what we know the Jaravas to be in a sense. And the Jaravas were actually able to advise him on how the interview should be shot so that the location and the identity is hidden. What he basically said, the Jarava apparently told him, is do a low angle shot so that there is no background, you only see the sky. So we will not know where this is shot, where the interview has been taken, and you are safe. So I think they are extremely kind of obviously intelligent people. And I've not personally had interactions with them. But, also more recently, just to kind of complicate further what you're saying, there was this huge controversy over a case that was first reported in the New York Times, and then also in the other newspapers, is where a Jarava child born out of a Jarava woman and another man from the outside, not a Jarava man, was killed when he was maybe 2 months old by a Jarava man. Because he said it doesn't happen in our community. We don't allow that to happen. Now,
you mean marriage outside?
Intercourse and yeah.
Somebody outside.
Yeah, somebody. So the child
like
was
an honor killing.
In some senses, yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's how it's been. That's what we know from what has come out. Now, on the one hand, it is honor killing, but what are the terms of engagement that we are going to deal? Is the Jarava to be caught and punished? What is the context in what that happens? In the cultural context that they come from, what does the state do? Because the thing that you mentioned is this paternalism that is there. Some senses I also feel journalism and activism has kind of contributed to that, because in some senses it is a function also of the success of throwing the spotlight and saying that this is important, this is an important context, this is a very unique ecology, these are people that require certain protection. It's kind of very, very difficult, and my personal position has become a lot more ambivalent than it used to be 15 years ago, partly because one realizes that there are no clear-cut solutions, and on the other hand, one sees the changing situation on the ground. So in the world of activism and journalism, I think where this particular community is concerned, we are still talking about something that is 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We've not caught up with the changes that are taking place. It's like the rug has gone out under our feet and we are still standing there. Right. So it's important that we discuss these things. That's not happening. And that's what I keep saying all the time, is that these stories have to be told and these questions have to be asked.
Right, yeah. So in terms of where the activism around the biological and cultural diversity of the islands is at today, what do you see as rays of hope? I mean, do you think you're fighting a defensive battle against these quite insane nuclear power plants and tourism projects which view the islands only as, beautiful real estate that you can make money off of? Or do you think there are other visions which are also in some way supported by people living there, which can maybe provide a more sustainable way of thinking about how to go forward?
I think that is the real big challenge. One is to challenge the dominant narrative. Because how do you, in today's, for example, the China question. I mean, it's the entire narrative on the islands today, even in the Ministry of Environment and Forests, I'm told, certainly in other arms of the government, is how do we challenge the China challenge?
What do you mean, growth?
I mean, no, because, the attempts that, because of the South China Seas and China's larger, interests, geopolitically, the moves that they are making, and shouldn't, with the Malacca Straits just south. So the strategic angle has become so important. Now, how does one...
And in fact, I think it's interesting to mention that the Lieutenant Governor who represents the head of
Yeah.
the government in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, is usually a military appointee, isn't that right?
Yeah, so for about half of the life of the independent Andaman Islands under Indian state, the chief administrator has been a military man. As of today, it is a person who was the chief of the Indian Navy, Admiral Joshi. So the strategic is very, very important, but the rhetoric and the narrative is being slowly ramped up. And so that larger narrative, how do we, of course there is a strategic concern, one just can't dismiss it, but is that the only narrative that we are going to deal with? Because I know for sure that in the next tsunami or the next earthquake, a lot more people are again going to die, whether China is there or not there. So and the point that I'm making is that in dealing with these threats that we perceive or the challenges that will come, are we not increasing the vulnerability of that island by having the ideas of a kind of development that is huge, is based on concrete, is based on size, is based on tourism, for instance, where there's a very interesting statistic where after the tsunami of 2004, for the first month, if you look at the graph, the arrival of tourists went down like this. It was like a vertical fall. Obviously, tourists don't want to go into a disaster zone. So putting all the eggs in that basket, for example, is a very dangerous kind of thing. So on the one hand that, on the other hand, how can we get the local people to talk and to be heard, as a matter of fact? And within that, the complexity of, there's the Jarawa and the indigenous communities, but there are also settlers who have come in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the Bengalis and the Tamils and the Malayalis. So there's a very interesting community from Burma, the Karens, in a little pocket of the Andamans that came in 1910 or 1920, brought in by the British. There's a whole bunch of people from what is today Jharkhand, Orissa. They actually called the Ranchis because they were recruited by the church in Ranchi in 1910 or 1908 as forest labor. So the Mundas and the Oraons and the Hos and there's a huge population there.
Are they recognized as scheduled tribes?
They're not recognized as scheduled tribes because that's the larger issue. But there's so many different cultures that have actually made that place home in the last 60, 70 years. So how will their voices be heard? Where will they end up all being mid-ocean real estate, and will they just become the outpost for aspirational, superpower aspiring country in that larger context? How can that stories be told? How can the stories be told from that side? I think that's the only thing we can do. Keep those stories alive. Right. Because activism, I've realized, has its limitations. And not to say no to activism, but can we tell the stories? A platform like this is to also then.
Right.
There are more stories, there are more layers to that place than we can ever imagine.
Right. I think this would be a good point to have a few questions and take the discussion forward. I'm going to ask the person, I can't quite see in this light, but yeah, and then the gentleman in front. Yeah.
It's actually perhaps completing or starting the story that you mentioned, Amita and Pankaj. How did these become, what is the historical accident that made them part of India?
Sorry, can you just hold the mic closer?
Sure. The historical accident that you mentioned that made these islands a part of India, what was that historical accident? The
British kind of taking them over to establish the penal colony. I mean, it's more complex than that, but basically when India became free, then there were contestations on where the island should go. But because the islands were part of British territory, they became part of India. So that's the historical accident in that sense.
Thank you.
The gentleman in front.
Yeah. I was in these islands last year.
Can't hear you. Keep it closer to your mouth.
Okay. I was there in the Andaman Islands last year, and just for a short time. So based on that and listening to your discussion, so you mentioned, so there is a concern about keeping the indigenous people, the Jawar, Jaras and others, isolated, primitive, and you already touched on that. And opposed to that, there is a concern that they should be integrated in the mainstream, education, health, and so on, you mentioned. But in this whole process, how can we hear the voices of what the indigenous people themselves want? What are their aspirations, especially the young people? because everywhere the young people want to join the mainstream. So I want your comments on that, and briefly, how to include, because I saw so many Indian tourists now. Domestic tourism is so huge in the islands. Not so many foreign tourists because of tsunami, but the middle class Indian traveler is very big footprint in those islands. And how to include them in the policy making. You didn't touch upon that. So these two questions. Thank you.
In case many of you couldn't hear those questions, I'll just paraphrase. The first question was about the fact that among all communities, there's change over generations. How do younger people among the indigenous communities of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands see their future? How do we include them in the conversation about where they want to go? That was the first question. The second question was about the large numbers of Indian tourists who visit the islands. I should mention that many of them who visit the islands are actually government employees, because the government gives you something called leave travel concession, which gives you free tickets to fly anywhere in the country once every, I think, 2 or 3 years. So the one time that I went there, the plane was full of, clerks and, government officials from Himachal Pradesh and from Rajasthan, all headed off to the furthest point that they could get the government to pay for their holiday from. So these are the two questions that, Pankaj.
I think to the first question, it's a question that I have myself. I mean, I think the challenge really is, I think, for want of a better word, a more methodological or even a philosophical one is, do we have the capacity, and like I mentioned again yesterday, do we have the humility to really want to listen? Do we have the capacity to create an equal platform of discussion? There's no point going to a smaller remote community, and even the language. I mean, how can, we've just about learned the Jarawa language. A few people know that language. Is it fair to expect them to really articulate their world and their universe and what they want in a language that is even not their own? I mean, it's at that level. So,
I'd like to add something.
Yeah, sure, please.
But go ahead and finish.
So the question is, the challenge is before us. One is our willingness, two is our capacity, and to be able to facilitate a conversation that is fair and that is equal. And I feel that we are extremely lacking and incapable of that kind of humility, for want of a better word. I've just started like that word a lot, but to allow for other people to speak and to be willing to listen. I mean, that's really, really crucial.
Yeah. But here I'd like to mention the work of an anthropologist, Vishwajit Pandya, that I find really very, very, rich and productive in this respect, because unlike the Anthropological Survey of India, which has a big presence on the islands and which I think regards itself as a guardian of these very small remaining populations, and the Anthropological Survey of India's official line at least is, oh, we must protect them. We must protect them from diseases and so on. And partly their policy today is, in fact, the realization of the ways in which their interference has actually made life so much worse for the islanders in terms of changing their diets, in terms of making them dependent on the government and so on. But what Vishwajit Pandya and his team who work with the Jarawa do is to try and talk to the Jarawa as much as possible about what they would like. So for instance, a number of Jarawa women said, we want to wear clothes. And this is partly a result of the fact that for years they've been laughed at and mocked because they did not wear clothes, because they didn't cover their breasts and so forth. So one can interpret that desire of the Jarawa women to want clothes as a sign of cultural dominance. But what Vishwajit and his team did was to discuss with them, well, what kinds of clothes? And these women said, well, when we are taken to hospitals, we wear these long shifts, these sort of nightgowns. That's what we want to wear, because that's convenient for us. We don't want to wear saris or blouses and so on. So then they had a discussion about, well, if you wear this kind of a gown, what length should it be? What fabric should it be made of? How will you wash it? And so forth. And they then also said, well, we're not going to give you these gowns that you want. You have to do something in order to be able to buy them. So the women then began to trade their baskets for these gowns. So this is, I think, the kind of careful attempt to negotiate with people in ways which don't result in creating dependencies, in ways which are respectful of what they want, but which try and help them along in making those desires as thoughtful as possible. And I think that ability to think along with people, to talk with them, as you were saying, Pankaj, to change the terms of negotiation, which have so far been so unequal, is the way forward. I think that's really the way to go. If you'd like to answer the question about tourism.
Tourism, I mean, it's growing very rapidly, and there's going to be a huge impact. And just more for the sake of more is the kind of logic that is. We just have to have more and more people. And I mean, recently, again, I write in the preface of the new book is the environment minister in 2016, when he went there, he said we want like 1 million or 10 million tourists to come. So it's like the scales are kind of bizarre. At the moment, you have 300,000 people. He wants it to be 30 lakh people, you know, like 3 million people just like overnight. So that has to be kind of really looked at. And my really was amazing memory of tourism, I mean, on lines of what you're saying, Amita, is in this hot, humid, tropical island. I remember one of these LTC tourists, this young girl, you know, she's going on this boat journey, which is extremely difficult. I mean, boats in our country, boats, you have to jump off. You know, in the red nylon salwar kameez, with thick jewelry, you know, high-heeled shoes. She must be miserable in that place. In the middle, like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's hot, there's no shade, she has to jump off a boat. So why are people going there? And I'm not saying they should not go there, but we also need to know why we are going there. And it's just that let's go there because or people are being encouraged to go there. And there's a lot of responsibility on the part of the industry and the state to say you can do certain things here. You won't find a Taj Mahal here, or you won't get to do shopping. And I mean, I just mentioned this recently when I was there. I was sitting in the circuit house where I was staying over breakfast, and there was this couple from Bihar, again one of these tourists, and they had their breakfast in the morning, and then they wanted to buy something from Port Blair. And the waiter who was serving us breakfast, he said, "यहाँ का मिठाई क्या है? हमको Port Blair का मिठाई क्या है?" So first this guy didn't understand. So they said, he was a Bengali. Said, "यहाँ क्या मिठाई मिलेगा? Port Blair का क्या मिठाई है?" So he thought for a while. He said, "Rasgulla." And those two people literally fell off the chairs because they're looking for something exotic, like what would be about the islands. And it's such a large Bengali. It's a very interesting rasgulla, by the way, in the islands. Initially, they would make it from milk made from milk powder. So it's got a particular texture, it's got a particular taste. But who's going to the... So, you know, that idea of what really is the islands is very central too.
I think that then what you're saying is that even that there needs to be a way of perhaps educating and preparing tourists that what you're encountering is not some material culture which is easily, you know, made into a commodity and can be taken away. But
that's the problem with tourism, because the commodification of cultures and all that is at the heart of the tourism enterprise today. The non-consumptive views that even in conservation we're talking about, saying that it's good, I think it's hugely problematic because we're not accounting for these challenges, and it has to be done, absolutely, absolutely.
Right. There are a number of questions. So one, the gentleman with the beard right here, one. And actually, let's take 2 or 3 because we're running a little short of time.
Can I do first? Because I was waiting a long time. Please.
Okay, but you already have the mic, so we'll make that the first one.
Yeah.
Second here, third over there, and fourth, the gentleman in the black jacket.
So, yeah,
Please keep your questions brief.
Brief, yeah, we'll try. I made a documentary about a tribe called the Batwas, and they're pygmies from Africa, Uganda. Their destiny is very sad. They used to live in a big forest in the south part of Uganda. In the same forest there are gorillas living, which are an endangered species also. And the government of Uganda in 1991 came into the forest, hunted all the people out with guns. 6,000 people had to leave overnight. And they converted that forest into national park. And today they charge $600 for each tourist that goes into that national park. So this is a really horrible destiny for the pygmies. And well, I've also been to the Andaman, and I've seen that in the Indian government, actually, I think doing a pretty good job there, because at least you help them and you try to protect them. And so, yes. But there are some problems. I read an article about the government.
Please keep your question brief.
Yeah,
there are
yeah,
three
it's
people waiting
soon coming.
to ask questions.
The government is giving aid to the Nicobar tribe after the tsunami. You give them money this way, but this is also a problem, because that way they quit their traditional life, which is meat fishing, right? And they become inactive, and many become alcoholics instead.
What's the question? What's your question?
What can the government do now to preserve these people from?
So the question is about displacement for natural resource conservation and the ways in which resettlement policies bring about more changes in people's life. Yep. You're number 4.
Talking of narratives, first, as you mentioned, it was about empty spaces. First, it was about empty spaces. Then, say, development. Then the parental concern or whatever. Then the strategic position. So, basically, the narrative keeps on changing. And obviously, environmentalists and activists, they all have their arguments about it. But where is the victory? Where is the victory for either of the parties? I mean, the victory so far seems to be on the part of the rulers, the government. The condition has just gotten worse, and I believe it's going to get even worse. So, is there any solution to any of these arguments? And the second question, talking of tourism, then like everyone is talking about the increased tourism and everything. But as we have seen in all the protected areas in the country, I'm actually talking about the tiger conserves and all. So, so far reports have shown that the tourism part didn't work actually for the areas. So, having more tourists, how is that going to help?
Okay, thanks. Yes. And if you can give the mic to the gentleman.
Hi, my question is, you're saying the minister wants 1 million tourists next year to come every year, right? Are the islands equipped to handle such large amount of people?
Okay. Thanks. Yes.
My question is there anywhere in the world a successful model of some people have successfully dealt with a small tribe and, without either decimating it by pushing in the popular culture or without, dealing with these two clashes of culture? Is there any successful model anywhere in the world? We know of the unsuccessful ones, the Aboriginals, the Australians, the Canadians, the US. Has anybody ever got it right?
I don't know if I have answered the question, but clearly we have not learned from those experiences. So at the end of the day, I know this becomes extremely depressing kind of a session because,
okay,
but maybe you can, okay, you go ahead then.
No, you with the other question.
So I mean, what can the government do is, the question that you asked is, I mean, they're doing what they think they should be doing. And the problem is, I think a lot of us think that it's not the right thing. But, but then the question is, what should be the right thing? And do we have the answer? I don't think I necessarily have the answers. And I increasingly have begun to feel as a writer, engaging with fiction and in journalism, is to keep asking the questions. Because I think somewhere the answers are embedded in the questions. So we've completely run out of time. So the questions have to be very, very important. Narratives are changing, and I think we have to keep engaging with those narratives. And the last, really, maybe that last 30 seconds, if you want to answer, if there's something that can be positively said.
Yeah. I think those narratives are not, they don't follow each other chronologically. They're in contention. People are fighting to make sure that these voices get heard. And that fight is an open-ended one. And the more people join in, the more it's likely that we will see something positive happen there. Finally, when I think of the inspiration about indigenous communities standing up for themselves and being heard, I think of New Zealand, where the Maori are respected by white people, where they have a prominent role in how environmental and other social legislation happens. If there's a country that we can learn from when it comes to indigenous people being equal partners and having control over resources, control over decision making, I think New Zealand, which is also a small island very far away from us, not as far as the Andaman, I think they're people that we should learn from. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you Pankaj for a fascinating session.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful